The Second Punic War lasted for 17 long years, a struggle that tested the endurance, strategy, and willpower of two of the ancient world's greatest powers, Rome and Carthage. In the beginning, fortune favored the Carthaginians. Led by the brilliant and daring general Hannibal Barca, Carthage's armies swept through Italy in a series of astonishing victories. The Punic winning streak reached its zenith at the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, where Hannibal annihilated a Roman army nearly twice his size. Over 50,000 Romans fell in a single day, and the fields of Apulia ran red with Roman blood. After this disaster, the unthinkable happened. Many of Rome's allies turned their backs on her. Entire cities opened their gates to Hannibal. Even some of the old Latin colonies hesitated in their loyalty. The Republic's network of alliances, the very foundation of its power, began to crumble. In Macedonia, King Philip V, honoring his pact with Carthage, launched attacks against Roman interests in the Adriatic. In Sicily and Sardinia, provinces Rome had only recently subdued, rebellions broke out. For the first time in centuries, the fate of Rome itself hung by a thread. To survive, Rome had to summon every ounce of its strength, discipline, and ingenuity. Its citizens endured heavy taxation, its fields were stripped to supply the legions, and its young men marched off to die in distant lands. The Senate refused to negotiate peace. The Republic, they swore, would never bow to a foreign conqueror. Year after year, the Romans fought the Carthaginians across Italy, Spain, and the Mediterranean islands. It was a war of attrition, one of grinding endurance rather than swift conquest. Gradually, the tide began to turn. Though Hannibal remained undefeated in open battle, his grand strategy to break Rome by dismantling her alliances began to fail. Hannibal believed that if he could shatter Rome's network of allied states, the Republic would collapse from within. But this very strategy limited his freedom of action. His army, deep in enemy territory, was forced to rush constantly between rebellious cities, shielding them from Roman counterattacks. Each time Hannibal captured new allies, he had to defend them, stretching his forces thin across Italy. Worse still, reinforcements from Carthage never came. The city's oligarchic council, dominated by merchants and politicians, treated the war as a business venture rather than a national struggle. They were reluctant to invest resources in a campaign so far from home. Instead, the Carthaginian elite focused on protecting their immediate interests. The silver mines of Spain, the lucrative trade routes in the western Mediterranean, and the rebellious islands of Sardinia and Sicily. Troops were sent to these theaters, but not to Hannibal. 9 years after the catastrophe at Cannae, Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal finally mustered an army in Spain and marched north to join him in Italy. His plan, if successful, could have changed history. But near the Metaurus River in northern Italy, Roman legions intercepted him. In the fierce battle that followed, the Carthaginians were crushed. Hasdrubal was killed, his severed head hurled into Hannibal's camp as a grim message. It was Rome's first truly decisive victory on Italian soil. The Senate called it revenge for Cannae. The psychological blow to Hannibal was immense. The vision of uniting his forces with his brothers across Italy, the plan that might have brought Rome to her knees, was gone forever. From that point onward, Carthage's fortunes waned. Spain fell to Roman arms, Sardinia and Corsica were secured, and Hannibal's control over southern Italy weakened. His legendary army, once the terror of the Republic, was worn down by years of campaigning. One by one, his allies deserted him, and the noose around Carthage tightened. Meanwhile, Rome found new energy in a rising generation of commanders. Chief among them was a young man who had witnessed the disaster at Cannae as a teenage tribune, Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known to history as Scipio Africanus. Scipio was born into the distinguished Cornelian family, a lineage that had already given Rome consuls and generals. He came of age in an era of despair and vowed to restore Rome's honor. When both his father and brother were killed in Spain, the young Scipio volunteered to take command of the Roman army there, an audacious move that shocked the Senate. Yet his charisma and confidence inspired soldiers and senators alike. In Spain, Scipio achieved what others had failed to do. He captured New Carthage, Carthage's main stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula, using a daring amphibious assault that demonstrated both tactical genius and psychological insight. He treated captured Iberian leaders with clemency, earning their loyalty rather than their hatred. Slowly, the Spanish tribes turned from Carthage to Rome. By 205 BC, Scipio had risen to the consulship, the highest office in the Republic. Stationed in Sicily, he conceived a bold and controversial plan to carry the war directly into Africa. His goal was not merely to defeat Carthaginian armies, but to strike at Carthage itself, forcing Hannibal to abandon Italy and return home. But the Senate, cautious and weary of long wars, refused to authorize a full-scale invasion. They denied Scipio additional troops, fearing another Cannae. Even so, the young consul refused to give up. He was permitted to raise volunteers and to command 2 legions already stationed in Sicily, the same legions composed of survivors of Cannae. These men, once disgraced and exiled, were consumed by a burning desire for redemption. Under Scipio's command, they found a new sense of purpose. He drilled them relentlessly, forging a hardened, disciplined force. He improved battlefield communication with new signal systems and reorganized supply lines to support longer campaigns. Yet Scipio faced one critical weakness: cavalry. Rome's mounted troops were inferior to Carthage's Numidian horsemen, who were the finest in the ancient world. Scipio knew that victory in Africa would depend on winning Numidian support. Years earlier, he had cultivated friendships with Numidian princes, especially Masinissa, a shrewd and ambitious leader. Masinissa admired Scipio's honor and skill, but Carthage sought to counter this alliance by marrying Hannibal's niece, Sophonisba, to King Syphax, Masinissa's rival. This diplomatic move shattered the Roman-Numidian pact. Masinissa, heartbroken and betrayed, fled into the desert with only a handful of followers. Yet his resentment toward Carthage grew, and Scipio never forgot his potential ally. Meanwhile, in northern Italy, Hannibal's other brother Mago landed near Liguria, attempting to rally the local tribes and march south to join him. Carthage also renewed diplomatic efforts with King Philip of Macedonia, urging him to resume hostilities against Rome. The Republic once again faced threats on multiple fronts, but Scipio was undeterred. While Rome's attention was divided, he prepared his daring African expedition. In the spring of 204 BC, the Roman fleet set sail from Sicily, landing on the African coast near Utica, the ancient city once considered the cradle of Carthage. His army numbered roughly 25,000 to 30,000 men, too few to storm Carthage itself, a metropolis larger and richer than Rome, defended by triple walls and thousands of mercenaries. Scipio understood this. He had no intention of besieging the city outright. Instead, he planned to devastate the surrounding countryside, provoke panic, and draw the Carthaginian army into open battle, where Roman discipline and strategy could prevail. Inside Carthage, panic indeed spread. The city had no standing army of its own. It relied on mercenaries and allied contingents, most of whom were still with Hannibal and Mago in Italy. Hastily, The Carthaginian Senate raised an allied army nearly twice Scipio's size and sent it to relieve Utica. Facing overwhelming numbers, Scipio withdrew, feigning weakness. The Carthaginians, believing him on the verge of defeat, proposed peace talks. Scipio agreed, not because he trusted them, but because he needed time. Masinissa was still in Numidia, rallying his scattered tribes, and Scipio knew that his arrival could change everything. While the Carthaginian commanders relaxed, confident that peace was near, Scipio struck. Under cover of night, Roman scouts set fire to the enemy camp. As flames erupted, the legions advanced in full force. Panic swept through the Punic ranks. Discipline collapsed. Thousands were slain. Syphax was captured, and the remnants fled. In one masterstroke, Scipio had turned apparent defeat into overwhelming victory. Africa trembled. In the wake of Scipio's devastating night attack, the Carthaginian war effort began to unravel. The capture of King Syphax was a blow from which Carthage would never recover. Masinissa, now the undisputed ruler of Numidia, rode to Scipio's camp in triumph. Their long-awaited alliance was finally sealed. Together, the Roman and Numidian forces swept across the countryside, subduing Carthage's remaining allies. The once mighty Punic Empire, whose influence had stretched from Spain to Sicily, now found its African heartland overrun. The Senate of Carthage, desperate to avert total destruction, sent envoys to Scipio, begging for peace. Scipio accepted their overtures, but the agreement he offered was harsh. Carthage was to surrender its fleet, hand over prisoners, renounce all claims outside Africa, and pay a heavy indemnity. The humbled Carthaginians agreed. Envoys were dispatched to Rome to confirm the treaty, yet even as they sailed for Italy, the Carthaginian Senate plotted deceit. Secret messages were sent to Mago and Hannibal, urging both generals to return home at once. The envoys who sailed to Rome were not diplomats of peace. They were instruments of delay, sent to buy time. But Rome's legions were relentless. Mago's forces, attempting to cross northern Italy, were intercepted near Insubria. The battle ended in disaster. Mago was mortally wounded, his army annihilated. He died aboard ship before reaching the shores of Africa. Hannibal, too, received the desperate call of his homeland. He had spent 15 years in Italy, undefeated in open battle yet unable to conquer the Republic. Now, with Carthage in peril, he prepared to return. But his departure was a retreat, not a triumph. Lacking enough ships to transport his entire army, Hannibal was forced to leave behind many of his loyal allies. Only his hardened veterans, the survivors of Cannae, Trebia, and Trasimene, accompanied him. When Hannibal landed in Africa, he was greeted not as a hero, but as the last hope of a dying empire. The Punic state was exhausted, its treasury empty, its fields burned, its people weary. Yet even now, Hannibal's presence rekindled courage. The Senate placed supreme command in his hands, but Carthage's leaders could not resist one last act of folly. Before Hannibal could rebuild his forces, they violated the truce with Rome. Carthaginian ships attacked a Roman convoy, sinking several vessels and killing Roman envoys. It was an act of desperation, and it sealed Carthage's fate. Scipio, furious at the betrayal, prepared for the final campaign. He advanced cautiously, avoiding premature battle, waiting for Hannibal to make his move. He knew the Punic general was gathering troops and elephants for one last stand. Hannibal, meanwhile, understood that this would be his ultimate trial. He had fought Rome for nearly 2 decades, from the snows of the Alps to the plains of Campania. He had crushed its armies, slain its consuls, and humbled its pride. But never before had he faced an opponent like Scipio, his equal in daring, strategy, and vision. The two armies met near the small town of Zama, southwest of Carthage, in 202 BC. Both commanders encamped within sight of each other, their camps separated by a broad, open plain. Hannibal sent scouts to study the Roman positions, but Scipio's patrols captured several of them. Instead of executing the spies, Scipio ordered that they be escorted through his camp, allowed to see everything, and then released unharmed. It was an extraordinary gesture, a psychological play designed to impress both Hannibal and his men. The next day, the two generals met in person. Their conversation, recorded by ancient historians, was calm and dignified. Hannibal, gray-haired but still formidable, proposed peace on lenient terms. Scipio refused. "The time for words has passed," he said. "Now we shall decide with the sword." Hannibal returned to his camp, knowing that battle was inevitable. At dawn, the plains of Zama echoed with the sound of war. Dust rose in thick clouds as the two armies formed ranks. Hannibal commanded roughly 40,000 men. A mix of mercenaries, Carthaginian citizens, Macedonian-style hoplites, Numidian horsemen loyal to Syphax's former faction, and 80 war elephants, the largest number he had ever fielded. Scipio's army numbered about 35,000, 2 Roman legions and 2 allied legions, supported by 6,000 cavalry. His greatest strength lay in the Numidian horsemen under Masinissa, 4,000 of them, fast and lethal on the flanks. Hannibal deployed his troops in 3 lines. The first consisted of mercenaries, Ligurians, Gauls, Balearic slingers, and Moors, men who fought for pay and plunder. Behind them stood Carthaginian militia and Macedonian allies, while in the third line were his battle-hardened veterans from Italy, the core of his old army. On the flanks he positioned his cavalry, and at the very front, his elephants. Scipio, recognizing the danger posed by these beasts, made a subtle but brilliant adjustment to Roman tactics. He arranged his manipular columns in straight, open lanes rather than the traditional checkerboard formation. Between these lanes stood the velites, lightly armed skirmishers armed with javelins. The morning sun glared off shields and helmets. Trumpets blared. Hannibal raised his hand, and the elephants charged. The earth shook as the massive animals thundered forward, their mahouts urging them on with whips and iron hooks. Yet Scipio had prepared for this moment. The Roman lines erupted in a roar of horns, trumpets, and war cries. The sudden cacophony terrified the elephants. Many panicked and turned back, trampling through Hannibal's own ranks. Others bolted sideways, crashing into his Numidian cavalry and throwing the Punic left wing into chaos. Still, dozens of elephants continued their charge. Roman velites hurled volleys of javelins, while Scipio's maniples calmly opened their lanes, allowing the beasts to pass harmlessly through. As they ran between the corridors, legionaries pelted them from both sides until the survivors fled the field entirely. Hannibal's plan had failed. His war elephants, meant to break the Roman line, had instead shattered his own formation. Now the infantry advanced. Hannibal's first line, the mercenaries, fought with savage ferocity. Gauls swung long swords, Iberians thrust short daggers, and Balearic slingers rained stones upon the advancing Romans. For a time, the front ranks locked in a brutal melee, but the mercenaries lacked discipline and coordination. The Romans, drilled, steady, relentless, pressed forward behind their interlocked shields. Soon the mercenary line began to buckle. They tried to fall back, only to find Hannibal's second line, the Carthaginian militia, blocking their retreat. Chaos erupted as mercenaries clashed with their own allies. The entire Punic front collapsed into confusion. Scipio seized the moment. He sounded the signal for his maniples to reform. In perfect order, His soldiers withdrew a short distance, regrouped, and brought fresh troops to the front. Hannibal, too, used the pause to reorganize his remaining forces. He brought his veterans from the third line forward, the men who had marched with him across the Alps and fought through 2 decades of war. These were no ordinary soldiers. Their armor was scarred, their banners tattered, their faces hardened by years of battle. They knew defeat was at hand, yet they stood ready to fight one last time for their general and their city. For a moment, the battlefield fell silent. 2 armies, both exhausted but unbroken, faced each other across the plain. Then, with a cry, the lines surged forward once more. Shields clashed, swords struck bronze, and dust swallowed the world. The final act of the Second Punic War had begun. The clash between Hannibal's veterans and Scipio's legions at Zama was unlike any that had come before. These were not green recruits or conscripts. They were the hardened survivors of nearly 2 decades of relentless war. Every man on that field understood that this battle would decide not just victory or defeat, but the very future of their homelands. At first, the 2 lines fought evenly. Hannibal's veterans stood firm behind their large oval shields, thrusting their long spears to keep the Romans at bay. The legionaries, disciplined and well-drilled, pressed forward in tight formation, advancing step by step, their short swords flashing in deadly rhythm. The dust that rose between them turned the plain into a choking haze. For what felt like hours, neither side yielded. Then the Roman horns blared, a deep, resonant call signaling the advance of the second line. The Principes moved up to relieve the exhausted Hastati, while the Triarii, Rome's veteran reserve, stood ready to close the battle. The disciplined coordination of Scipio's army began to tell. Hannibal's mercenaries had fled or perished. His Carthaginian militia was in disarray. Only the veterans from Italy, the men who had once crushed Rome at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, still held their ground. But even they were now vastly outnumbered. Meanwhile, on the flanks, the cavalry struggle reached its turning point. On the Roman left, Gaius Laelius led the Equites, while on the right, the Numidian horsemen under King Masinissa clashed with Hannibal's riders. The fighting was swift and violent. Spears clattered, horses screamed, and clouds of sand swallowed the combatants. The Numidians, lightly armed and faster, gradually gained the upper hand. Masinissa, once an ally of Carthage, now fought with ferocious determination for Rome. His horsemen harried the Punic cavalry, feigning retreats, then circling back to strike from behind. When Laelius joined the assault from the opposite flank, Hannibal's cavalry line finally broke. The Carthaginian riders fled, pursued relentlessly by their Roman and Numidian counterparts. The moment was decisive, but Scipio waited. He knew that victory was not yet assured. On the field before him, Hannibal's infantry still held. The Punic general had arrayed his remaining men into a single extended line, locking shields shoulder to shoulder. He placed his most experienced troops, the veterans of Italy, on the right, where he himself commanded. Their bronze helmets gleamed in the sun, their silence betraying both exhaustion and grim resolve. Scipio ordered his lines forward again. The Romans advanced with steady precision, reforming their maniples into one continuous wall of steel. The air vibrated with the crash of shields and the shouts of men. Swords thrust and struck. Pila flew in deadly arcs. Step by step, the Romans pushed forward, their discipline grinding down the Punic resistance. But Hannibal's veterans did not break. They fought as if possessed, each man a living memory of campaigns that had once shaken the Republic to its core. Even as the ground beneath them turned to mud with blood and dust, They held. Then, in the distance, the thunder of hooves grew louder, the sound of cavalry returning. Masinissa and Laelius, having routed the Punic horsemen, were galloping back to the field. Their banners snapped in the wind as they swung around behind Hannibal's line. The Carthaginians, already hard-pressed in front, now faced an attack from the rear. Scipio gave the signal. The Roman horns blared once more, their echoes rolling across the plain like the voice of fate. The legions surged forward. Masinissa's cavalry slammed into the Carthaginian rear, cutting down men who tried to flee. Surrounded on all sides, Hannibal's army began to collapse. What had begun as an orderly resistance turned into chaos. Discipline disintegrated as soldiers threw down their weapons and ran, only to be struck down by Roman blades or trampled beneath hooves. Still, pockets of Punic resistance held out. Hannibal's veterans formed tight defensive circles, fighting to the last man. These soldiers, the same men who had crossed the Alps, endured winters in Italy, and triumphed at Cannae, refused to surrender. They died where they stood, encircled and outnumbered, their courage unbroken even in defeat. When the dust finally settled, the battlefield was a graveyard. Over 20,000 Carthaginians lay dead, and another 20,000 were taken prisoner. Roman losses numbered around 5,000, a heavy toll, but a small price compared to the annihilations of earlier years. Hannibal himself escaped with a handful of horsemen, retreating to Hadrumetum. His calm and composure, even in ruin, impressed friend and foe alike. He had done all that human skill and courage could do, but fate had turned against him. The Battle of Zama was over. The Second Punic War had ended, not with a treaty negotiated in pride, but with a decisive Roman victory that would reshape the Mediterranean world. Carthage, once the master of the seas, was now broken. The Senate sent envoys to Scipio, suing for peace. This time, there would be no deceit, no delay, no hope of reversal. The terms were crushing. Carthage was to surrender all war elephants and all but 10 of its ships of war. It could wage no war, even in self-defense, without Rome's permission. All captured prisoners were to be returned, and a massive indemnity, 10,000 talents of silver, was to be paid over 50 years. Rome also demanded the extradition of key generals and the disbanding of Carthage's armies. Carthaginian expansion was over. The city that had once rivaled Rome was reduced to a client state, its future chained to the will of the Republic. Scipio returned to Rome in triumph. The Senate granted him the title Africanus, the conqueror of Africa. His name joined the pantheon of Roman heroes, Camillus, Fabius, and Marcellus. The people hailed him as the savior of the Republic, yet even amid celebration, Scipio remained magnanimous. He refused to destroy Carthage completely, arguing that mercy would serve Rome better than vengeance. "Let us not," he said, "make the desert our neighbor." But not all Romans shared his restraint. Cato the Elder, who had risen to prominence during the war, ended every speech with the same ominous phrase, "Carthago delenda est." Carthage must be destroyed. In time, that call would echo louder and louder, until the city's final destruction half a century later. For now, however, the Mediterranean belonged to Rome. Its legions stood supreme from the Pillars of Hercules to the Aegean Sea. The Republic, once on the brink of collapse, had emerged as the dominant power of the ancient world. The war that had begun with Hannibal's daring march through the Alps had ended with his defeat in his own homeland. In 17 years, both sides had shown brilliance and courage beyond measure, but only one could survive. The victory at Zama did more than end a war. It defined an era. It marked the rise of Rome from a regional power to a global empire, and signaled the beginning of Carthage's long descent into memory. Hannibal's fate after Zama was as tragic as it was inevitable. Returning to Carthage, he was greeted not as a hero but as a scapegoat. Though he was elected to high office and sought to reform the city's finances, his enemies in the Senate, ever jealous and fearful of his fame, turned against him. When Rome demanded his surrender years later, Hannibal fled into exile, wandering from court to court across the eastern Mediterranean. He served as an advisor to kings, always watched by Rome's agents, never at peace. At last, cornered by Roman envoys in Bithynia, he chose death over capture. According to legend, he carried poison hidden in a ring. "Let us free Rome," he said with a bitter smile, from its long anxiety. With Hannibal's death, a chapter of history closed. He had been the greatest enemy Rome ever faced, and perhaps the greatest general the world had ever known. The Second Punic War left scars that would shape the destiny of both nations. Rome emerged stronger, more ruthless, more confident. Carthage survived, but as a shadow of its former self, a merchant city living under the shadow of its conqueror. The Mediterranean, once contested between equals, now belonged to a single power. Rome had learned the cost of survival, and it would never forget. And so, from the ashes of Cannae to the sands of Zama, the struggle between two civilizations came to an end. The age of Carthage was over. The age of Rome had begun.